The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas is an enduring classic that has spawned several books, plays, and movies. The latest movie involving the Three Musketeers will debut in the U.S. in October of 2011. The Three Musketeers contains the adventures of the young Gascon nobleman D'Artagnan, who arrives in Paris in 1625 with a sword and an attitude. He challenges three members of the King's Musketeers of the Guard to single combat, and after taking him down to size, the three men take him under their wing and they embark on the first of their many adventures together. Using a combination of espionage and daring do, the quartet must avert a war between France and England by assassinating the high-ranking English nobleman, the Duke of Buckingham, who is to command a relief expedition to the town of La Rochelle. The four men accomplish their objective and go on to have many adventures together. The Three Musketeers is actually the first book in a trilogy written by Alexandre Dumas, all chronicling the events and the lives of D'Artagnan and his three rowdy friends. Like many skilled historical writers, Dumas manages to weave the great events and great people of history with minor characters and a healthy dose of his own imagination to create a plausible storyline of what might have happened behind the scenes in those events long ago and far away. The year 1625, when D'Artagnan supposedly arrives in Paris, is a momentous one in history because it marks the beginning of the reign of Charles I of England. Charles I was well known for his belief in what's called the divine right of kings. Charles believed that he had been placed by God in his position as king and that he, with God's guidance, would decide what was appropriate for his subjects in matters of war, religion, and other state policy. Parliament was there simply to rubber stamp the king's decisions and to provide the tax money. Charles was Anglican, but preferred a form of Anglican worship that for many of his subjects seemed uncomfortably close to that of Roman Catholicism, with an emphasis on church ritual and the clerical hierarchy. Some believe that Charles' attitude was influenced because either he was a secret Catholic or because he had married a French princess. Charles' attitude toward religion was in sharp contrast with many members of Parliament and of the army who were of the Puritan persuasion. Puritans were also Anglicans, however, they wished to purify the Church of England by toning down some of the religious ritual, de-emphasizing the role of the hierarchy, and placing more emphasis on sermons and Bible study, among other things. Charles further alienated his Puritan subjects by choosing to repose his trust in an individual who was not only greedy and ruthless, but also dangerously incompetent. This was George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham. George Villiers had been born in 1592 and had come to the court of Charles's father, James I, as a young page boy. James I had a predilection for young boys, and he and George soon became lovers. James showered money, lands, titles, and other benefits on his favorite until George Villiers became one of the most rewarded courtiers in English history, eventually becoming the Duke of Buckingham and the Lord High Admiral of England, his only qualification for that post being that he was the old king's lover. Some have speculated that the Duke of Buckingham and young Charles were also lovers because when his father died, the new King Charles continued to repose his trust in Buckingham and gave his approval for one of the Duke's more wilder schemes. The Duke of Buckingham wanted to replicate the adventures of the great Elizabethan sea dogs and so staged a naval raid on the Spanish port town of Cadiz in 1625. The raid was a fiasco, and all it did was prompt Spain to declare war on England. Not to be outdone, the Duke of Buckingham would soon be up to more trouble. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XIII, the second Bourbon king, was king of France. His sister Henriette was married to Charles I, so the two of them were brother-in-laws, which no doubt added to the tension of their situation. Louis XIII was keenly interested in building up the army that later generations of French kings and emperors would make famous. He outfitted a troop of his guardsmen with a musket, these muskets being long-barreled, smooth-bore, muzzle-loading weapons with a higher caliber of ball than that we're familiar with in our Revolutionary War. To become one of the King's Musketeers was a high honor, and commissions as officers in the Musketeers were open to only the most noble men of the most noble families. King Louis also chose to repose his trust in someone who, although he was greedy and ruthless, was a bit more competent. This was Armand Jean du Plessis, later known to history as Cardinal de Richelieu. Richelieu had been born in 1585 to a wealthy and powerful Parisian noble family. As many young sons of such families, he joined the church and rose quickly through the ranks to become a cardinal. Because of his family's position at court, he also gained the king's trust and in 1624 became King Louis's first minister. Louis then detached a group of his musketeers to act as the cardinal's personal bodyguard and honor guard. Some attributed Cardinal Richelieu's success to the fact that he may have been the lover of Louis's wife Anne. However, there is no historical basis that Anne and Richelieu were lovers, let alone the fact that Anne might have been having an affair with the Duke of Buckingham. One of the things that Louis and Cardinal Richelieu agreed upon was that the French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were becoming too powerful for their own good. The Huguenots were primarily concentrated in the western French seaport towns of Saint-Martin-la-Ré and La Rochelle. These seaport towns were located on the western coast of France in the Bay of Biscay area, and they were two of the most prosperous towns in France. There, the Huguenots of France were joined by Protestants from around Europe who were fleeing religious oppression. They eventually wanted to separate these two towns from French control and recreate them into religiously based city-states. Louis and Richelieu were determined to prevent this and led a punitive expedition against the towns of Saint-Martin and La Rochelle in 1627. Meanwhile, back in England, Buckingham decided that he wished to be considered as the champion of all Protestantism in Europe and convinced the king to allow him to lead a joint naval and land-based expedition to relieve the sieges on the two French towns. The result was yet another disaster, and now England and France were on the brink of war. Not to be outdone, Buckingham returned to England and began preparing another naval expedition. In 1628, while he was in Portsmouth preparing to go back to France, he was confronted by a young Puritan army lieutenant named John Felton, whom fatally stabbed him. Buckingham died of his wounds a few hours later. Felton was arrested, taken to London, and interrogated. The most that could be deduced was that he was Puritan. He had been on the first La Rochelle expedition and had been severely wounded, and for some reason had fixated on the Duke of Buckingham as an enemy, believing that the Duke had unfairly deprived him of a deserved promotion. There was no indication that Felton was working on anybody's orders or was part of a larger conspiracy. Like many political assassins of his day, and since, he was working on his own and for his own, probably very disturbed mental health issues. However, with the death of the Duke of Buckingham, plans for a second expedition to La Rochelle faded, and the tensions between England and France dissipated for the time being. It was against this lush historical backdrop that Alexandre Dumas chose to pose his four characters. However, none of the men on whom these characters were based were members of the Musketeers at the time these events took place. Charles de Batz-Castlemore was born in the southern French town of Loubiac in 1611. He came to Paris in 1630 and took his mother's last name, D'Artagnan, because her ancestry was much more noble in lineage. With this new and improved identity in 1632, he became a member of the King's Musketeers of the Guard. He soon came to the knowledge of Cardinal Richelieu and did perform several sensitive missions of espionage for the Cardinal. However, it wasn't until 1640 when two other Gascons joined the King's Musketeers, Armand d'Athos and his friend Henri d'Aramis. Henri at one point had considered a career in the church and had even become an abbé, which is a French term denoting a person who is in training to become a priest. However, he decided that the swashbuckling life was more to his liking and joined the Musketeers instead. The trio was complete in 1642 when Otho's cousin, Isaac de Poitou, also joined the King's Musketeers. As Europe was involved in almost continuous warfare at this time, these four Gascons found plenty of opportunity to get themselves in trouble. And in 1673, as depicted in Dumas' last novel, Charles d'Artagnan would die during the Franco-Dutch War at the siege of the Dutch town of Maastricht, which is now located in the Netherlands. This happened in 1673. The town of Maastricht still honors D'Artagnan with a statue in their town square. However, he did not die, as Dumas depicts, as a Marshal of France. One of the few things that D'Artagnan had not managed to pull off in his lifetime was to be able to lead a victorious army in battle during war, which is the criterion to become a Marshal of France. That honor instead would fall to his maternal cousin Pierre, Count d'Artagnan, and it is Pierre, Count d'Artagnan's name, who is on the roll of the Marshals of France. Nevertheless, Charles d'Artagnan's exploits would continue to fire the imaginations of writers, and in 1700 a French writer by the name of Gatien de Sandras pens a semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical memoir of Charles d'Artagnan that purports to be written by Charles himself. It is from Gatien de Sandras' work and the fact that Pierre d'Artagnan is listed among the marshals that gave Dumas the inspiration for his novel The Three Musketeers and its two sequels, 20 Years Later and The Vicomte de Bragelonne. So it's an enduring classic, and well-deservedly so. Also an enduring and classic work of early example of good historical fiction writing, and one of my favorites.